The void had always known strange lights, the flares of dying suns, the cold gleam of derelict stations, the hateful scars of warp storms that burned like wounds in reality. But on that night, when the Astronomican's holy glow pulsed across the Imperium's breadth, a different light cut through the dark. It was green, not the emerald of jewels nor the faded green of corrosion, but a brutal, living hue, virulent and impossible, as if the color itself carried weight. It blazed across the firmament like a spear hurled from the hand of a god. Worlds watched. Ugly serfs paused in their harvest fields and crossed themselves, whispering catechisms against evil omens. Minister and priest declared it the herald of chaos and cried for purification rites. Rogue psychers screamed themselves hoarse, frothing with visions of a colossal form striding through burning marshes, and on a nameless border world, a planet of mudflats, broken cathedrals, and stagnant bogs, the green star came down. Its descent was catastrophic. Atmosphere boiled where it passed. Lightning bloomed across the skies. Voxcasters shrieked with static, their hymnals breaking down into blasphemous laughter. The comet struck swampland on the world's eastern hemisphere with a shockwave that leveled forests and split the earth like glass. For days afterward, the crater fumed with noxious vapors as though the very ground was ashamed to host what had landed. Out of the wreckage crawled the figure. At first it seemed like any other beast born of nightmare and war. Hulking, broad-shouldered, towering above even Ogren's, its skin was a shade of swamp green that glistened wet under the toxic rain. Muscles coiled like cables beneath scarred flesh, its jaw jutted forward, tusk-like teeth glinting in the shadows. Yet its eyes betrayed a strange intelligence, deep-set pools of weariness, fury, and something half-forgotten, solitude. The figure stood, shaking clods of smoking earth from its shoulders. It exhaled, the breath steaming as though it carried the heat of another world. And then, though no mortal tongue should have spoken it, a voice rumbled from its maw. "This is my swamp." The sound rolled like thunder over the crater, a proclamation of dominion, not plea. The bogs themselves seemed to quake, waters rippling outward in concentric circles as if answering their new master. Imperial surveyors, dispatched in haste after the comet's fall, were the first to bear witness. They came in armored carriers, vox beacons blazing, their commanders spitting orders through incense-choked rebreathers. To them, the figure was a Xenos incursion, a heretical mutation of Orc strain perhaps, to be catalogued and executed. Their lasguns snapped red beams into the fog as they advanced, chanting the name of the Emperor. The figure did not retreat. With movements impossibly fast for such bulk, it surged forward, slamming one enormous hand into the mud. Earth erupted, blinding the troopers. From the haze it emerged, shoulders hunched, raw, shaking the marrow of men. A dozen guardsmen fired, beams hissing against its hide. It only grew angrier. Its massive fist came down upon the lead squad, crushing bodies and armor alike in a spray of iron and blood. Vehicles toppled as though swatted by a titan. The survivors fled, screaming over broken vox channels, their cries of terror captured in fragments. Not Orc, by the throne, not Orc. Green giant, swamp god. Emperor, protect us. By the time reinforcements arrived, nothing remained but mud, shattered steel, and the stench of blood mingled with swamp gas. The figure was gone, stalking deeper into the bogs, leaving only footprints vast enough to drown a man. But the Orcs found him. Like vultures to carry on, feral greenskin tribes drawn by the comet's light had trekked across the marshes. They saw him not with the fear of men, but with the awe of faith. Their brutish minds did not question the impossibility of his arrival. To them he was obvious, inevitable. Here was the living embodiment of Gork and Mork, larger, stronger, meaner than any warboss they had ever followed. His swampy stench was perfume to their crude senses. His roar was prophecy. One by one, mobs of Orcs dropped their choppers into the mud and bellowed their WAAAGH cries. The sound was deafening, a hurricane of devotion. The giants stared at them, tusked jaw flexing as if torn between rage and amusement. For though he was no Orc, their reverence awakened something primal in him. For too long he had lived alone in silence, a creature of solitude. Now thousands of howling warriors knelt in filth before him, eager to kill and die at his command. The swamp itself whispered in approval, reeds rattling like bone flutes in the toxic breeze. He stepped forward, squelching mud beneath colossal feet, and extended one hand. A single Orc, braver than the rest, approached and pressed his skull against that hand in reverence. The Green Titan nodded once, a gesture of acceptance. The Orcs erupted again, the WAAAGH. rising like the roar of a storm tide. The green star had not merely fallen, it had ceded dominion. The Imperium would name him heretic, alien, nightmare. The orcs would name him Warboss, prophet, god. But he alone beneath the burning sky whispered his own truth once more into the swamp's fetid air. "This is my swamp." And the bog answered with silence, deep and eternal, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Yet in the distant void, where the Astronomicon flickered faint against encroaching night, something stirred, a ripple in the warp, whispers too faint to decipher. The arrival of the green star was no accident. Other eyes had watched it fall. Other powers would not ignore it. The first WAAAGH! The first WAAAGH! Cry had been born, and its echo would shatter more than a single world. The question remained, was the galaxy ready for a warlord such as this, or had the galaxy itself conjured him in its madness? The crater where the green star had fallen did not remain barren for long. From its boiling depths spread a sickness, reshaping the land as though the planet itself bent knee to the will of the intruder. The soil grew soft and treacherous, water seeped from unseen veins, and trees, blackened and gnarled, began to rot where they stood. The place became a swamp, filthy, endless, alive with insects that hissed like whispered curses. The figure, the green giant, wandered this land with heavy steps. Each footfall left depressions that filled with water, forming pools where none had existed. Where his shadow passed, reeds and vines erupted, clutching at the broken earth. He was building without tools, sculpting without design. His presence alone reshaped the terrain. What had been a scar from the comet's fall became a kingdom of mire. The orcs came in greater numbers, stumbling through the marshes, answering some instinctual call. They were drawn to him not just by sight or scent, but by belief. The orcs had no need for proof. They saw him, and that was enough. Their crude minds interpreted his dominion over swamp and mud as a miracle. He did not raise banners or shout commands, yet already mobs squabbled over who would bring him the juiciest meat, who would build the largest fire, who would shout his name the loudest. And though he said little, the orcs heard volumes. When a warband brought him scrap iron scavenged from the ruins of a manufactorum, he merely looked upon it, eyes smouldering like embers in fog. In silence, he dragged the shattered plating into the bog. The metal hissed as the swamp claimed it, vanishing into mud. Hours later, the muck bubbled, and out of it rose new forms, crude walls of steel and bone fused together, dripping with filth, jagged and monstrous. The orcs roared in approval, calling it a mere hold, though the giant only whispered again his own word, swamp. He had created a fortress without plans, as though the bog itself obeyed him. Towers of rusted girders and tangled roots rose like the teeth of some colossal beast. Gates fashioned from broken tank hulls and oaken trunks slammed into place with thunderous echoes. It was ugly, uneven, alive, and to the orcs it was perfect. Inquisitorial reports would later describe it as a mutation of Xeno's culture, a hybrid of natural swamp and orcish fortress building, grown rather than assembled. But no savant, no magos could explain how a lone being had willed such things into existence. The records that survived were blacked out, marked heretical, punishable by death if spoken aloud. The swamp fortress grew with every passing day, and with it grew the legend of the warlord who had come from the stars. The orcs, in their brutish tongues, began to give him titles. For some called him Ada Big Stink, others a swamp boss, but a name began to spread with greater force. A Dahlgren king, for the greenskins it was simple. He was too big to be anything else. To the Imperium, those whispers carried a deeper horror. What if Abuman strains truly had birthed a godlike leader among the Xenos? But the figure himself, Shrek, though no mortal tongue here yet knew that name, showed no sign of reveling in titles. He wandered his marsh in silence, swatting down any orc too loud, smashing skulls when mobs fought too close to his keep. His rule was brutal but clear. This was his swamp, his domain, and those who trespassed upon it would serve or be destroyed. The orcs loved him for it. Discipline born of fear bound them tighter than any warlord before. From the edges of the swamp, scavenger bands returned bearing trophies. Rusted sentinels dragged half-submerged into the bog. Basilisk guns torn from their mounts offered like sacrifices. The figure watched, then thrust the relics into the mire. The swamp swallowed them whole, belching steam and sludge. Hours later, the metal rose again, twisted into obscene shapes, walls and towers that made the fortress stronger. The orcs began to see the swamp not just as home, but as weapon. Their crude songs changed. No longer did they chant only the names of Gork and Mork, they chanted his. WAAAGH thundered across the wetlands, echoing into the skies. The stars themselves seemed to dim as if recoiling, but the Imperium too had taken notice. Astropathic choirs shrieked of a new terror. Green lightning storms blurred the Astronomican's light. Vox networks carried fragments of reports from the first massacres. Commissars executed men who spoke too vividly of the creature they had seen, branding their words heresy. Still, the rumors spread like infection. An abomination had come, wearing the flesh of an orc, but something more, something wrong, something primal. The Inquisition prepared. Yet on the world itself, within the swamp, Shrek stood atop the crude walls of Meyerhold. Below him, tens of thousands of orcs bellowed their devotion, stomping the mud into rivers of slime. He looked out across the marshlands he had claimed, across the rusting towers, the bone gates, the endless fog. He should have felt triumph, but his eyes, dark and deep, carried the weight of memory. The solitude of his old life far from this galaxy clung to him like chains. He had never sought followers, he had never craved crowns, and yet the swamp itself here had forced it upon him. His voice rumbled low, almost to himself. "This is my swamp. This is my swamp." But this time the words did not echo only through the bog. They echoed through the hearts of thousands, reshaping the dreams of every greenskin who heard them. And far away, aboard an inquisitorial flagship, a woman in robes of black iron opened her eyes in the middle of prayer, sensing the ripple in the warp. Her lips moved, whispering a name that had not yet been spoken aloud, a name born of fear and prophecy. The hunt for the swamp warlord had begun. The swamp was never silent. It breathed, it whispered, it groaned like some ancient beast. Yet on that day, when the fog hung heavy and the stench of oil and blood rolled over the marshes, something greater stirred within its choking mists. Shrek sat upon his crude throne, fashioned of twisted iron plates and the rib cages of beasts dragged from the mire. His bulk slouched forward, hands clasped upon his knees. He looked less like a king than a prisoner, a colossus shackled not by chains but by destiny itself. Below him the orcs gathered, thousands upon thousands, a tide of muscle and iron, their crude banners sagging in the rain. They howled, fought, and bit one another in their eagerness to be close to him. Gretchen scuttled about with offerings of fungus ale and half-rotten meat, casting them into the mud at his feet. Squigs barked and snapped in the shadows, devouring scraps. The swamp fortress of Meyerhold groaned with the weight of its new children, its jagged towers rising above the fog like broken teeth. The orcs demanded a sign. They had followed him from the marshlands, seen his strength in battle, witnessed him raise fortresses out of filth. But for all their brutish faith, orcs craved the blood rush of war. They needed the storm of sound that united them, the spark that set their kind ablaze. They needed the WAAAGH cry. And so, one warband after another took up the challenge. They bellowed their lungs, raw howls shaking the swamp, voices rising until the fog itself trembled. But Shrek remained unmoved. His yellow eyes drifted over the mob with weary contempt. Their cries lacked weight. They lacked ownership. They were loud, yes, but hollow. Then came the Imperials. An armored patrol had pushed too close to Meyerhold, emboldened by auguries that whispered of weakness. Their chimera transports churned mud as they advanced, turrets sweeping the mire. Guardsmen deployed in lines, lasguns humming with charge. Above them, servo skulls flickered, capturing every image for the Inquisition. The swamp fell silent at their approach. Even the orcs quieted, nostrils flaring, fists clenching around their brutal weapons. They looked not to the humans, but to the figure upon the throne. Their warboss had not yet spoken the cry. Without it, the orcs were merely a mob waiting. Shrek rose. The sound of his movement was thunder. His massive form cast the battlefield into shadow. He descended from his throne of bone and iron, feet sinking into mud with every step. The guardsmen raised their rifles, prayers to the Emperor rasping from their lips. Their officer barked orders, voice shaking. Shrek walked into the line of fire without hesitation. Lasbeams tore through the fog, striking him in the chest, the shoulders, the throat. Steam hissed from his skin as if the shots had struck living stone. He did not falter. His hand reached out, seized one of the chimeras by its armored hull, and with a roar he hurled it aside like a toy. Metal screeched as the vehicle flipped end over end, crushing soldiers beneath its weight. The orcs erupted in glee, their crude laughter booming across the swamp. But still Shrek did not shout. He waded through fire, fists like siege engines, striking down men whose screams vanished beneath the roar of engines and the snapping of bones. Another chimera shattered beneath his blow, spilling oil and flame. Guardsmen scrambled, some kneeling in desperate prayer, others firing wildly. None could withstand him. The swamp boiled with slaughter. And then it came. Shrek tilted his head back and opened his maw. What emerged was not mere sound. It was a bellow that cracked the air, that sent ripples racing across the waters, that drove birds shrieking into the skies. It was deeper than any orc's voice, more terrible than the thunder of artillery. It was the cry of dominion, of rage and possession, a proclamation that the swamp, the battle, and the very stars above belonged to him. The orcs answered. They howled as one, a single monstrous chorus. The WAAAGH was born in that instant, not as tradition, not as ritual, but as a living storm. The psychic energy surged, feeding upon itself. Green lightning crackled across the swamp towers, arcing between rusted battlements. The fog itself seemed to ignite, glowing with unnatural light. Guardsmen fell to their knees, clutching their skulls as the WAAAGH flooded their minds, shattering thought, drowning prayer. Their officer screamed orders unheard, blood streaming from his ears. Foxcasters melted into slag. Even the earth quaked, mud splitting, open to swallow the dead. Slowly, the orcs surged forward. They tore into the Imperial lines with a savagery no human wall could withstand. Shoppers rose and fell, teeth and blades grinding through flesh and armor alike. Squigs bounded from the mire, jaws snapping through throats. The swamp drank deeply of blood that day. At the center of it all stood Shrek. His fist smashed men into ruin, his roar guiding the tide. To the orcs he was no longer a warboss. He was the WAAAGH, incarnate, a prophet of mud and iron whose presence alone magnified their madness. They called his name in broken shouts, warping it into brutal syllables that echoed across the battlefield. The Imperials broke, survivors fled into the bogs, pursued by laughter and death. Those captured were dragged before Shrek, their eyes wide with terror. One whispered through broken teeth, "You are no orc," he in a close breath hot with swamp rot and iron. His reply rumbled low, almost lost beneath the orc's cries. "This is my swamp." The prisoner screamed, but the words were drowned by the next wave of WAAAGH energy. By nightfall, nothing remained of the patrol but burning wreckage and bones sinking into muck. Above Mirehold, the sky was streaked with green lightning, as if the galaxy itself acknowledged what had begun. The first WAAAGH cry had been unleashed. It would not end with this battle. It would spread, system by system, until the stars themselves trembled beneath its roar, and in the void beyond, alien voices whispered. The warp had taken notice. Was this swamp-born warlord a herald of Gork and Mork, or had something else, something older, stranger, cast him here to mock the galaxy itself? The swamp fortress did not grow by mortal labor alone. It writhed, it shifted, as though some hidden will sculpted it with every hour. Mirehold had become a living wound upon the world, half structure, half marsh, where steel bones jutted from the mud and vines strangled broken engines into grotesque spires. Fires burned atop the walls without fuel, casting a sickly light that shimmered across stagnant waters. It was less a fortress than a blasphemy against nature, an edifice that should not be, yet was. At the heart of Mirehold stood the throne, forged of tank hulls, sharpened rebar, and the skulls of beasts. It rose like a jagged altar. The orcs had built it with their own hands, dragging wreckage, hammering steel, and lashing it together with wire and sinew. They offered their sweat and blood to the shape of their devotion. When it was done, they stepped back, awed by its hideous majesty. They had created a throne unfit for any but him. Shrek ascended it in silence. The orcs erupted into cheers, a storm of guttural roars. To them, this was coronation. They had no crowns, no anointing oils, no priests. They had only noise, and noise was enough. The swamp shook with their voices, the towers of rust groaning as if the earth itself despised the sound. Shrek slouched upon the iron seat, tusked jaw tight, his eyes half hidden beneath the shadow of his brow. He had never wanted a throne. He had never sought to lead. Yet the swamp had forced it upon him, just as it had once forced solitude upon him in another world. Now solitude was gone. He was no longer alone. He was shackled to a people of endless hunger, a horde that demanded war. His swamp was no longer his alone. was no longer his alone. Below him, mobs clashed in crude tournaments. Warbands fought to earn the honor of standing closest to his throne. Gretchen scurried with torches, setting fire to the bodies of the fallen, their shrieks joining the thunder of drums hammered out upon steel plating. Squigs barked and snapped in their pens, drunk on the madness of the WAAAGH, for energy that still crackled in the air. Yet Shrek's gaze was not upon them. He looked past the mob, out through the jagged gates of Mirehold, where the swamp stretched toward horizons drowned in fog. The air stank of rot, blood, and oil. He inhaled deeply, as though drawing power from that stench. "This is my swamp," he murmured again. The words carried, though his voice was low. The orcs heard them, and they roared louder than before, stamping their feet until the mud churned into rivers. To them, his claim was not solitude, it was command. His swamp was theirs now too, and to fight for it was holy. They began to carve his likeness into the walls. Crude, jagged effigies, made from scrap metal and driftwood, lined Mirehold's outer defenses. Huge tusked faces, their eyes hollow, leered from the fog. To the orcs, they were wards of power, protective icons. To Imperial spies watching from afar, they were abominations, idols of a god that should never exist. Whispers spread through the swamp. Orcs muttered of his strength, his silence, his dominance, his dominance. Gretchen babbled tales of miracles, that when he walked, rivers shifted their course, that his shadow crushed the weak, that his breath alone summoned the stench of battle. Some dared to call him more than Warboss, some dared to name him God, but not all eyes upon Mirehold were orcish. Beyond the swamp, in the ruined city of Carthus, Imperial Guard regiments gathered in silence. Commissars barked sermons, whipping discipline into men whose hearts quailed at the green thunder beyond the horizon. Priests of the Ministorum declared the swamp fortress a festering shrine of heresy. They promised fire, promised death, promised the Emperor's light would burn this filth from the stars. Yet even their voices shook when the wind carried the WAAAGH, cries from afar. In orbit above the planet, an inquisitorial vessel lingered. Its prow bore the sigil of the Ordo Xenos, its hull dark and pitted from decades of war. Inside its sanctum stood Inquisitor Thalissa, her augmetic eyes fixed upon the data feeds. She had seen the green giants rise in fragments, broken Vox reports, grainy picked captures of burning vehicles, the trembling prayers of soldiers driven half-mad by psychic storms. Now she beheld the image of Mirehold itself, taken by servo-skulls daring enough to skim the swamp's edge. What she saw shook her to her core. Not an orc fortress, but something worse, something becoming. "This is no ordinary WAAAGH," she whispered. "This is heresy given form." Her hand hovered over the rune to summon exterminatus protocols, yet she hesitated. To purge the world now would be to admit failure, to admit fear, and fear was heresy. She clenched her jaw, eyes burning. This creature would be studied, then slain, nothing more. But in the swamp, Shrek sat upon his throne of iron and bone, surrounded by thousands of howling disciples. His swamp had become a kingdom. His kingdom had become a weapon. And his weapon would soon turn outward, toward the galaxy that had dared to notice him. The throne groaned beneath his weight. The swamp whispered in the hiss of insects, in the croak of hidden beasts. The air vibrated with prophecy. Far beyond the fog, across the stars, the Emperor's Imperium shuddered without knowing why, and in the depths of the warp, demons laughed. For when a throne is raised, war is never far behind. The swamp's thunder could not be contained. Vox network screamed with static wherever its echoes reached, garbled reports of a warlord too immense, too terrible, to be bound by common reason. Entire regiments sent into Mirehold's shadow vanished, their last transmissions drowned by green lightning and incoherent prayers. The planet's governor, once proud in his marble palace, now wept in private, begging his astropaths for evacuation rites. But the astropaths themselves were breaking, their eyes bleeding from visions of mud teeth and a hulking green figure crowned upon a throne of rust. And so the Inquisition came. The Ordo Xenos had long prepared for orcish infestations, yet this was something else. Fragmentary images told of a creature unlike any Warboss catalogued in the archives, too broad for even the largest strain, too articulate for a brute, too deliberate. Worse still were the psychic disturbances. Astropaths across the sector dreamt of swamps swallowing cathedrals, of a giant's voice echoing the same words again and again. "This is my swamp. Inquisitor Thalissa was chosen to lead the purge. Clad in black armor traced with silver sigils, her face pale beneath the shadows of augmetic lenses, she walked the halls of her vessel like a living verdict. The men of the guard stiffened at her presence. Tech priests muttered litanies louder when she passed, as if her silence demanded louder prayers. She did not speak often, but when she did, her voice cut like a blade. "This creature is not orc," she said to her assembled captains. "It is a blasphemy wearing their form. It is a parody of the Emperor's design, a monster not of nature but of mockery, and it will burn." The captains bowed their heads. To disobey was death. Yet even among them fear lingered. Reports of the Green Warlord's battles were like nothing they had known. Chimera squadrons hurled aside as though they weighed nothing. Guard platoons drowned in mud that rose like a living tide. Bolter fire swallowed in silence. And always that voice, recorded by shattered vox echoing still, a voice both monstrous and strangely human. On the planet's surface, the Inquisition made its move. Stormtroopers in black carapace armor dropped from Valkyries, their descent engines screaming across the fog. They landed upon dry ridges at the swamp's edge, spreading Auspex beacons and Vox disruptors in a ring of steel. Servo skulls drifted low, capturing images. Priests lit censers, chanting prayers into the murk. The air stank of incense, swamp gas and blood. The swamp reacted. Mist thickened. The waters stirred with unseen movement. Lights green and baleful flickered in the depths. One trooper's Auspex screamed warning, but before he could speak, the ground opened beneath him. A massive hand, slick with mud, seized him and dragged him into darkness. His scream was brief. Then the orcs came. They surged from the bog in mobs, howling with their crude banners raised high. Choppers glinted in the fog, teeth bared in manic laughter. Stormtroopers formed firing lines, hotshot lasbeams lancing into the green tide. Bodies fell, but the orcs did not falter. They poured forward like a flood, each death feeding the madness of their charge. And then the swamp split open. Shrek emerged. His silhouette filled the mist, taller than a dreadnought, broader than the gates of Meyerhold itself. He waded into the stormtroopers as if they were reeds. His fist came down, crushing 3 men at once. Another sweep of his arm tore through armored bodies, scattering them like broken dolls. Bullets sparked against his skin. Lasbeams hissed and died. He bellowed and the WAAAGH answered. Inquisitor Thalissa stood at the ridgeline, her retinue around her. She did not flinch as the Green Warlord slaughtered her finest. Her augmetic eyes whirred, recording every detail. To her, this was not a battle. It was confirmation. This was no mere orc warboss. This was something birthed of nightmare, perhaps even of the warp. She raised her rosarius high, its golden light piercing the mist. "By the authority of the Emperor of Mankind, I name you abomination." Her voice rang, amplified by voxcasters. "You will be purged from his galaxy." Shrek turned his head. For a moment, his eyes met hers. They were not the eyes of an orc. They were old, weary, smoldering with something beyond hatred. Something human. He raised his fist in silence. Mud dripped from his knuckles like blood. The orcs howled, surging around him, drowning the stormtroopers in a tide of iron and filth. Thalyssa's jaw tightened. For the first time in her long service, she felt the faint whisper of doubt. The swamp roared, the WAAAGH shook the heavens, and the Imperium's firepower faltered against a will older and stranger than they had imagined. Was this creature truly alien, or had the galaxy itself conjured him to mock the Emperor's light? The Inquisition's assault had faltered. Though stormtroopers fought with holy fury, the swamp devoured them as surely as it did the mud-choked carcasses of tanks. The survivors withdrew to the ridgelines, scarred and shaken, muttering prayers they barely believed. Yet not all of the Imperium's servants perished that day. Some were taken. The orcs did not kill everyone they captured. Some they kept for sport, chained in rusted cages and dragged through the mire to amuse their new warlord. Most prisoners screamed until their throats bled, begging for the Emperor's mercy as greenskins mocked them. But among those captives were ogrins of enormous size, childlike minds twisted to service in the Astra Militarum. To the guard they had been loyal shock troops, simple and obedient. To the orcs they were curiosities. Shrek noticed them at once. He strode through the swamp as the Gretchen prodded their prisoners with sticks. The ogrins stood taller than the men beside them, their massive frames bent by chains, their broad faces slack with confusion. They were accustomed to orders shouted by commissars, accustomed to being told who to strike, where to march, when to eat. Now, bound and surrounded by jeering greenskins, they had no master's voice to follow. Their small eyes widened when they beheld Shrek, looming above them like a reflection of their own kind magnified to divine scale. The orcs expected slaughter. Their warboss would crush these prisoners for sport or throw them into the bog for the squigs, but Shrek did not raise his hand. He only stared, long and slow, his yellow eyes narrowing. Something stirred in the silence, a recognition neither human nor orc could voice. One ogryn spoke, his voice low and trembling. "A boss!" The swamp fell quiet. The orcs barked laughter, shoving the ogryn to his knees. Thum. But the warlord did not laugh. He stepped forward, mud sucking at his heels, until he towered directly above the chained-up humans. His breath rolled out hot and heavy, stinking of swamp gas and blood. Then he raised his hand, not in violence but in command. The orcs fell silent. The ogryns trembled. In their simple hearts a thought began to take root. Here was not just a boss. Here was kin. Here was a king. Here was a... That night, as Meyerhold's towers burned with orcish fires, rumors spread among the captives. The ogryns whispered to one another in broken tongue, speaking of a giant who was like them but greater. They called him the Ogryn King. They said he had come from the stars to free them from the whips of commissars, to give them a place where their strength was not mocked but revered. The orcs heard these tales and mocked them. At first, to them, the ogryns were little more than pets, too soft to fight, too dim to understand war. Yet Shrek listened. He lingered near the cages, silent, his shadow looming over the abhumans as they muttered their crude myths. Perhaps he understood. Perhaps he remembered what it meant to be chained, to be driven from one's home. When dawn came, the ogryns were freed. The orcs jeered, but none dared defy their warboss's will. Chains were broken, and the massive brute stumbled into the mud, blinking at the light. Shrek pointed to the walls of Meyerhold, and the ogryns obeyed, lifting rusted girders and shattered tanks with ease. They built as though they had always belonged, their laughter booming across the swamp. The legend grew. Human prisoners whispered that the warlord had tamed even the ogryns, bending them not through cruelty but through kinship. To the Imperium, this was heresy upon heresy upon heresy. Ogryns, once loyal sons of the Emperor, now served as Xeno's warboss. But to the swamp, to the orcs, it was only proof that their warlord was greater than any before. If even the half-men obeyed him, surely he was more than flesh. Surely he was chosen. Word spread beyond the swamp. Rogue traders, smugglers, and deserters carried tales into the void. They spoke of a warlord not entirely orc, who commanded not only greenskins but abhumans as well. They described his fortress of mud and iron, his voice that cracked the skies, his throne of bone. Some laughed, dismissing the story as drunken lies. Others listened in silence, shivering at the thought that such a being might truly walk among the stars. Inquisitor Thalissa listened as well. She stood in her sanctum aboard the orbiting vessel, augmetic eyes flickering through streams of intercepted reports. Every account burned her ears, but one above all filled her with dread. The ogryns had bent their knee. Ogryns, creatures bred to loyalty, incapable of complex rebellion, now worshipped the swamp lord as kin. That was no accident. That was influence. That was corruption at its most insidious. "This is not a war, boss," she whispered to herself. "This is an idea, and ideas are harder to kill than flesh." On the world below, Shrek sat upon his throne, silent as ever. Around him the swamp lived, the orcs bellowed, the ogryns labored. His eyes stared into fog no one else could see, as if searching for something lost. His hand rested on the throne's arm, heavy and sure, a king in truth if not in desire. And though his lips did not move, the swamp seemed to carry his voice to every ear, whispering the same words over and over, until even the ogryns began to chant them in broken chorus. "This is my swamp." The orcs roared, the ogryns wept with joy, the Imperium trembled, and in the warp something vast and ancient turned its gaze toward this rising myth, as if amused by the shape destiny was taking. If the ogryns could see him as king, how long before others, human, orc, or worse, began to believe as well? The swamp had become a beacon. Across the continent, orc tribes stirred. Feral mobs that had once fought each other for scraps of meat and rusted blades now raised their eyes to the horizon, drawn by a sound carried on the wind, the echo of the first WAAAGH cry. It was not merely a call, it was compulsion, a hunger that clawed at their skulls and set their teeth chattering. The green tide began to move. From blasted wastelands came the speed freaks, engines coughing smoke and fire, tires kicking up storms of mud as they raced toward Meyerhold. From the mountains trudged the snakebites, clad in hides and bearing crude totems of bone, chanting to their savage gods as they marched. From shattered hive ruins crawled the Goths, black-armored brutes whose fists already dripped with the blood of rivals. They came not to fight each other, but to kneel at the swamp's edge, to hear the voice of the warlord who had claimed the world. Meyerhold groaned with their arrival. The fortress expanded, towers of rust and bone rising higher, bridges of twisted metal spanning bogs that swallowed lesser men whole. Orcs fought for the honor of sleeping nearest to the throne. Squigs bred in the muck until their roars became a constant undertone to the WAAAGH's chorus. And in the heart of it all sat Shrek, slouched upon his throne, silent but sovereign. The orcs did not need speeches. His silence was enough. The swamp itself seemed to speak for him, hissing, croaking, whispering through the mouths of insects and the bubbling of mud. When he stirred, when he shifted his massive bulk even slightly, mobs erupted into frenzy. A gesture of his hand sent warbands charging into the marsh to tear apart intruders. A low growl brought silence that even the loudest knob dared not break. He was more than Warboss. He was instinct given flesh. And still they came. The Ogrins worked beside the orcs, their chains long discarded, their massive hands lifting wreckage and forging new defenses. They sang crude songs in broken tongue, praising their Ogrin king. The orcs joined in, though their verses twisted the name into new shapes. Ida Big Boss, Ada Swamp God, Ada Green Star. Titles multiplied, each mob inventing its own, yet all agreeing upon one truth. He was theirs, the WAAAGH. Energy swelled. Invisible to most, yet undeniable, a storm of psychic power gathered above Meyerhold. Orcs were creatures bound to belief, their collective will bending reality. Now their belief had found a focus unlike any before. The air grew thick with it, green lightning sparking across the towers, rain falling in sheets of acid. Machines that should not function roared to life simply because the mobs believed they would. Chappers rusted through one moment, then gleamed sharp as razors the next. Reality frayed at the edges. Imperial agents watching from afar felt it in their bones. Guardsmen in outposts wept without reason, their hands trembling as the sound of distant drums filled their ears, though no drums were played. Astropaths screamed into the void, their skulls bursting with visions of swamp stretching across the stars of a green colossus crowned in mud. Inquisitor Thalissa felt it most of all. Her ship drifted in orbit, its auspex arrays straining against the storm of psychic interference. She stood alone in her sanctum, staring at the hololith projection of the continent. Where Meyerhold lay, a great green light pulsed, throbbing like a heart. Each beat was louder, stronger, as if the world itself were changing its rhythm to match the warlord's. "This cannot continue," she hissed. Her voice was iron, yet her hands shook. "If this WAAAGH spreads beyond this world, no fleet will halt it. We face not an orc, but contagion." Her acolytes bowed their heads, some muttered prayers. One dared to ask, "Exterminatus, my lady." Her silence was the only answer. Back on the surface, the swamp prepared for war. The warbands no longer fought for scraps, they trained. Knobs beat their mobs into crude ranks. Mech boys cobbled together engines of war from scavenged parts, smoke-belching monstrosities that staggered out of the muck with teeth painted across their hulls. Pain boys sharpened their crude instruments, ready to stitch warriors back together for another charge. Everywhere the WAAAGH! Cry rose, growing louder, deeper, until the very clouds shook with its force, and at the center Shrek finally stood. The swamp fell silent as he rose from the throne, his bulk towering above the gathered tribes. His eyes glowed faintly in the fog, reflecting torchlight like molten gold. He did not roar nor speak. He only raised one hand. The gesture was enough. Tens of thousands of orcs bellowed as one. The WAAAGH thundered outward, a psychic storm that rippled across the stars. Entire cities trembled beneath its echo. Hive towers cracked, manufactorums shook, and vox lines failed. The swell of green had begun, and as the echo reached into the warp, demons whispered his name. They did not call him orc. They did not call him alien. They called him something far worse. They called him Avatar. Was this swamp-born warlord the herald of a new orc god, or the birth of a truth too blasphemous for even chaos to speak aloud? The swamp groaned beneath the weight of armies. Meyerhold, once a scar upon the world, had grown into a fortress whose silhouette defied nature. Towers of rusted iron and bone rose from the muck-like claws reaching for the sky. Bridges of scrap and vine stretched across poisoned bogs, and great gates of fused tank hulls stood crooked yet immovable. Smoke belched from crude chimneys and green lightning flickered between the towers as if the swamp itself were alive. From the horizon came the hammer of the Imperium. Columns of lemon rust tanks rolled across ridgelines, their treads crushing mud and bone alike. Basilisks set their guns into position, barrels aimed at the fortress. Infantry lines spread wide, platoons in grey and khaki trudging forward through rain and rot, las guns clutched to trembling chests. Overhead, Valkyrie gunships swept low, searchlights stabbing into fog. At their head marched commissars in long coats, voices hoarse from endless sermons, for the Emperor, for his light, for mankind's survival. The swamp answered with silence. Then, with a groan like the world itself exhaling, Meyerhold's gates opened. Orcs poured out in a tide of green. Knobs bellowed commands, boys roared laughter, and engines belched flame as ramshackle trucks burst through the mire. Squigs bounded forward, tongues lashing, eyes wild with blood hunger. And above them all, rising from the fog like a mountain clothed in shadow, came Shrek. The first volley fell. Basilisks thundered, shells screaming overhead. The swamp convulsed as explosions tore through its surface, geysers of mud and water spraying high. Whole mobs vanished in the blasts, bodies flung like broken dolls. Yet the WAAAGH cry did not falter. If anything, it grew louder. Lasfire cut into the charge, beams hissing as they struck green flesh. Dozens fell, charred holes burning in their torsos, but the tide did not stop. Orcs surged over their fallen, howling louder. Gretchen were trampled underfoot, their shrieks ignored in the rush. War was not deterred, it was fed who was fed. Shrek strode at their center. A basilisk shell struck near his feet, the blast hurling orcs into the air. He did not falter. He seized the twisted wreck of a truck and hurled it into the Imperial line. The vehicle crashed down upon guardsmen, crushing them beneath rusted steel. His roar shook the battlefield, and the orcs answered with renewed fury. The Imperials braced. Commissars raised their bolt pistols, executing deserters without hesitation. Priests screamed hymns into the storm. Tanks fired again and again, their cannons pounding the swamp, but the tide only grew stronger. For every orc slain, two more seemed to rise, dragged from the mire as if the swamp itself bred them. The battle became a slaughterhouse. On the fortress walls, mech boys unleashed their crude weapons. Cannons belching scrap metal, mortars firing rusted blades, contraptions of smoke and flame that defied logic. Storms of jagged shrapnel cut through Imperial lines. Squads broke apart under the madness of it, vox channels filled with static and screams. The guard counter-charged. Bayonets fixed, they stormed into the mire, their boots sinking deep into muck. Lasfire snapped in disciplined volleys. For a moment, the orc tide faltered. Bodies piled high. Commissars shouted victory. Then Shrek came. He waded through fire like a beast from myth, mud clinging to his hide, his fists dripping red. A squad charged him, lasguns blazing. He swatted them aside in a single swing, their bodies torn into the air. A lemon russ rumbled forward, its cannon aimed at his chest. He grasped the barrel in both hands and bent it like wax. With a heave, he toppled the tank, crushing its crew beneath. The WAAAGH! Energy surged. The orcs' laughter turned frenzied, their eyes glowing with fanatic belief. Green lightning tore through the battlefield, striking Imperial machines, overloading vox-casters, frying comms. Guardsmen clutched their heads, their minds breaking under the psychic storm. Whole platoons routed, only to be cut down by commissars desperate to hold the line. The swamp itself betrayed them. Mud bubbled and rose, swallowing tanks whole. Roots lashed out, tripping men and dragging them screaming into water thick with teeth. Poisonous mist rolled in, burning eyes, corroding armor. The battlefield was no longer neutral ground, it was the warlord's domain. Still, the Imperium did not yield. Valkyries screamed overhead, unleashing rockets that ripped orcs apart by the dozens. Stormtroopers rappelled into the mire, firing plasma into knobs, cutting swathes through the horde. Commissars rallied what men remained, driving them forward into the very jaws of the swamp. Yet no victory could be taken while Shrek remained. Atop a mound of corpses he stood, roared and slammed his fists into the earth. The ground quaked. Orcs bellowed louder, their WAAAGH! Cry shaking the heavens. Imperial formation splintered, the line breaking. A single word carried on the storm of sound, echoed across the swamp, half believed, half dreaded. Swamp. The guardsmen fell back, battered and bleeding, their numbers broken. Tanks burned in the mud, Valkyries fell smoking into bogs, and whole companies lay devoured by the mire. By dusk, the Imperium's first siege of Meyerhold had ended not with victory, but with retreat. From the walls, the orcs laughed and roared. The WAAAGH. Banners flapped in the foul wind, kicked with blood and grime. Shrek returned to his throne of iron and bone, slumping upon it like a king wearied of triumph. His eyes burned faint in the dark, reflecting the fires of the battlefield. The Imperium had come with fire and steel. They had found mud and madness instead, and in the warp demons whispered the question none dared speak aloud. If Meyerhold could not be broken by a world's worth of firepower, how many systems would fall before the swamp warlord was stopped? The swamp had roared, and the Imperium had recoiled. The Imperium had recoiled. Meyerhold stood unbroken, its towers of bone and rust gleaming with green fire in the night. Orcs feasted upon the bodies of guardsmen dragged from the mud, while squigs gorged themselves on the dead until their bellies split. Drums made from the stretched hides of fallen foes thundered into the fog, carrying the rhythm of victory. But beyond the battlefield in the silence of the void, the echoes reached further than any orc walkery should. In the warp, the scream of the WAAAGH reverberated like thunder rolling through eternity. It was not the simple psychic discharge of orc belief, though that alone was formidable. No, this was something deeper, more discordant. It rippled across the immaterium like a stone cast into stagnant water. Demons stirred in its wake, whispering through teeth that were not teeth, in voices that bent sanity. They whispered of the green colossus. Some called him a parody, a mockery of the Emperor's creation. Others hissed that he was an echo of Gork and Mork, but greater, twisted by some alien law. Still others only laughed, for laughter was the only response when reality itself birthed such a monstrosity. In hidden shrines, chaos cultists convulsed, their flesh bubbling as they screamed visions of swamps, swallowing entire hive cities. The faithful of Nurgle dreamed of his bulk rising from filth, crowned in rot. Teasing sorcerers trembled, seeing their schemes unravel in the wake of a creature who followed no plan but his own. Even the servants of Khorne paused, uncertain whether to honor him as a champion of slaughter or despise him as a mockery of bloodshed. And Slaanesh laughed. The warp had taken notice, and once the warp's gaze fell, it did not turn away. On the mortal plane, psychers felt it most keenly. Across the sector, sanctioned witches screamed in their cells, clawing at their eyes, babbling of swamps without end. Astropaths carrying imperial messages died in fits, their skulls cracking under pressure from unseen hands. Even navigators aboard void ships grew blind for hours at a time, their third eyes filled with visions of mud, teeth, and a voice repeating endlessly, "This is my swamp." The echo twisted faith as well as fear. Among the survivors of the siege, some guardsmen muttered not of the Emperor, but of the creature they had seen. They whispered of his strength, his defiance, his terrible dominion. Commissars executed them for heresy, but each shot only birthed new converts. The cult of the swamp warlord had begun, not among greenskins, but among men. Inquisitor Thalisa knew it. She had seen it in the reports, the hesitation in soldiers' eyes when they spoke of the battle. She had heard it in their voices, the awe beneath the terror. She walked her ship's corridors in silence, her augmetic eyes replaying hololith fragments, the giant tearing tanks apart, the swamp swallowing steel, the way entire companies broke at a single roar. She knew what it meant. This is contagion," she said aloud, her voice echoing in her sanctum. Not only of flesh, but of faith, her acolytes dared not answer. The Inquisition's creed was clear. No Xenos could inspire loyalty in man without warp corruption. To follow such a being was not only heresy, it was damnation. And yet, how could such corruption exist without a patron? Shrek bore no sigil of the ruinous powers. His cry was not to Khorne, not to Nurgle, not to any known god. His words were his own, simple yet unyielding. "This is my swamp." That truth was more dangerous than open allegiance to chaos. For chaos thrived on corruption, on bargains, on temptation. This warlord offered nothing. He simply existed, and in his existence he bent reality. Back in Meyerhold, the orcs grew restless. The WAAAGH. Energy swirled around them like a storm barely contained. Boys fought endlessly, not only because they craved it, but because the power demanded it. Each clash of blades released sparks of psychic force. Each roar sent tremors through the fortress walls. The swamp was becoming unstable, the line between matter and immaterium thinning. Shrek sat upon his throne, silent, his eyes deep pools of thought. Did he know what stirred in the warp? Did he hear the whispers of demons, the laughter of gods? None could say. To the orcs his silence was wisdom, to the ogrins it was kinship. To men it was terror, but in the warp silence was not silence, it was defiance. It was defiant. The echoes spread further still, reaching even into the Black Library where hidden Alidari seers bent their minds upon forbidden visions. They whispered in panic of a figure who did not belong, yet whose presence might tilt the balance of fate itself. Some saw him as a weapon to wield against chaos. Others saw him as a doom greater than chaos itself. The galaxy had taken notice, and the Swamp Lord, unaware or uncaring, remained seated upon his throne, surrounded by a storm of voices that were not his own. Was he a herald of the green-skinned gods, or the birth of something entirely new, a power that would not fit into the galaxy's old lies? The swamp was never quiet, yet on that day a deeper silence fell, a silence heavy with expectation, the hush before a storm. Blood filled her mouth, her ribs splintered, but still she rose. Shrek paused. For the first time he looked at her not as prey but as opponent, his eyes narrowed, almost respectful. Then he roared, the sound tearing through the air. The orcs erupted their WAAAGH, cry shaking the fortress walls. The swamp boiled. Green lightning blazed across the sky. Thalissa raised her blade one last time, her prayer lost in the storm. She leapt, blade poised for his heart. Shrek caught her in mid-air, his fist closed, crushing steel and flesh alike. The power blade sputtered, its light dying as mud and blood mixed. Yet even broken, she spat words into his face. "You are not God, you are only beast." His eyes burned like embers. He leaned close, his voice a whisper that only she could hear. "This is my swamp." He hurled her broken form into the mud where priests and guardsmen screamed her name. The orcs howled triumph, their WAAAGH cry rolling like a storm across the battlefield. But in the warp, the duel had already echoed. The demons had seen. The gods had listened. And the question now twisted through reality itself: had the Swamp Warlord truly defeated the Imperium's fire, or had he merely begun a war that would drown the stars? In the aftermath of the duel, the swamp did not quiet. It boiled. The WAAAGH. The WAAAGH. Energy swelled like a fever, surging through every orc that had witnessed their Warboss crush the Inquisitor. They roared his name, or some mangled version of it, their voices carrying into the clouds like artillery fire. Meyerhold's towers gleamed with lightning, each strike feeding the fortress rather than shattering it. Yet among the sea of greenskins, it was not the Nobs or the Warbosses who first named him divine. It was the smallest, weakest, most wretched of them all, a single Gretchen. He had been nothing, one of countless vermin that scuttled through the swamp, scavenging scraps and dodging the fists of larger orcs. Yet something in him had broken during the battle. He had seen the giant seize the Inquisitor, crush her like parchment, and roar words that shook both heaven and earth. His tiny eyes had filled with light, his cracked lips spilling laughter that grew into prophecy. He climbed the battlements of Meyerhold, dragging himself up iron and bone, his limbs trembling with frenzy. The orcs jeered, throwing stones and bones at him, but he did not fall. He reached the highest point of the fortress and raised his thin arms to the storm. "Listen, Jägits!" He shrieked, his voice shrill yet cutting through the thunder. Dis ain't just a boss. Dis ain't just a Warboss. Dis is de third god." The orcs roared laughter. Some hurled spears, others spat, but his words carried. "We got Gork, we got Mork, but now we got Shork." The swamp fell silent. For a heartbeat, even the storm paused. The WAAAGH, energy wild and untamed, seemed to lean closer as if listening. Orcs glanced at one another, unsure whether to laugh or kill the runt. But then, one by one, they began to howl. "A Shork, 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 Shork!" The chant swelled, echoing from the walls, shaking the swamp itself. Knobs bellowed the name. Boys slammed their choppers against the mud in rhythm. Squigs barked it, their voices twisted by the storm. And above them all, the lightning split the sky in green fire, as if the warp itself had answered. The Gretchen prophet shrieked, his eyes rolling back, foam spilling from his mouth. "He ain't just Warboss, he's the swamp god. The Mud Lord, the big green star what fell from the sky. He's the one what'll stomp the galaxy flat." The orcs howled with such fury that Meyerhold's walls shook. The prophecy spread like fire in dry grass, consuming every mob, twisting their chants. They no longer cried for Gork and Mork alone. Now a third name filled the air: Shork. Shrek did not move. He sat upon his throne, slouched eyes shadowed. To any other creature, the worship of thousands would have been intoxicating. To him it was a chain. His swamp was no longer swamp, it had become shrine. His throne was no longer seat, it had become altar. He muttered the same words as always, but now the orcs heard them differently. "This is my swamp," he said, and they roared as if he had given liturgy. The Gretchen prophet was dragged down from the walls, beaten and bloodied by larger orcs, but none killed him. For even the thickest boy knew the storm had answered his cry. His words carried power now, and power was survival. They brought him before the throne, broken but grinning through bloody teeth. "Da God spoke through me, boss," he wheezed, bowing low. "You're not just Warboss, you're Shork. Da third God." Shrek looked at him for a long moment. His yellow eyes burned through the runt, heavy with silence. Then without a word he turned away, sinking deeper into his throne. The prophet grinned wider. To the orcs his silence was proof. To them silence was not denial, it was acceptance. That night Mirehold became more than a fortress, it became temple. The orcs painted glyphs across the walls, scrawling crude faces with tusks and wide jaws, each one larger than the last. Totems of bone and rust were raised, draped in fungus hides. Fires burned green, fed by strange oils bubbling from the swamp itself. And all through the night they chanted, "A Shork, Shork." The echoes carried far beyond the swamp, across ruined cities, into the ears of men and ogrins alike. Guardsmen deserters whispered of a third god rising among the orcs, a god of mud and iron. Iron. Priests denounced it as heresy, yet even they trembled when the name slithered through their lips. The warp rippled with laughter, demons amused by the blasphemy. Inquisitor Thalisa, broken yet alive, heard the name whispered in her dreams as she lay upon a Medici slab. "A Shork," the voices hissed, taunting her even as her ribs were bound. She clenched her teeth, whispering prayers to drown them, but the prayers rang hollow. The swamp had crowned a god, and though he had not asked for worship, though his silence bore only weariness, the galaxy did not care. Belief had power, belief had weight, and the belief of orcs was the most dangerous power of all. If Shork was real only because the orcs believed, what would happen when all of them across the stars heard his name? The swamp could no longer contain them. Mirehold bulged at its limits, its walls groaning under the weight of mobs too numerous to be housed within. Boys spilled into the bogs like floodwater, their boots sinking into muck that bubbled with green fire. Warbans fought in the shadow of the fortress, not for scraps, but for the right to march at the warlord's side. And march they did. It began as a trickle, bands of orcs stomping through the mire, choppers raised, their chants echoing into the fog. But within days it became a tide. 1,000,000 throats bellowed the WAAAGH. Cry, their voices shaking the bones of the planet. The orcs did not march in ranks. They thundered as a storm, endless, chaotic, and terrible. Knobs led mobs that stretched to the horizon. Squigs bounded beside them, snapping teeth and howling with hunger. Trucks rattled and roared, their engines belching flame. Stompers cobbled together from the bones of ruined tanks staggered out of the swamp, each step sinking deep but rising stronger. At their center strode Shrek. The warlord loomed above them all, his bulk a silhouette against the green lightning that raged perpetually above Mirehold. Each step he took sent ripples through the bog, as if the earth itself shuddered under his claim. He did not roar, he did not wave banners, his silence was command enough. For silence was command enough. The WAAAGH surged around him like a living storm, fed by his presence, amplified by the faith of 1,000,000 voices. The march was not toward the swamp alone. It stretched outward across the continent, devouring all in its path. First fell the outlying villages. Hive refugees and scattered regiments tried to resist, their lasguns spitting red light into the green tide. But the orcs crashed upon them like ocean waves, sweeping through walls of ferrocrete, tearing men apart with choppers and teeth. Fires rose, staining the sky crimson, and still the WAAAGH pressed on. Cities followed. The hives of Carthus Prime had stood for centuries, their spires reaching into the clouds, their manufactorums churning unceasingly for the Imperium's endless wars. Now their towers cracked under the swarm. 1,000,000 greenskins poured through the lower habs, swarming like insects, biting and hacking and burning. The streets became rivers of blood and sewage. Lemon Rush squadrons rolled through the avenues, their guns hammering, their hulls smeared with purity seals. For a time, they held. But then Shrek came. He tore through ferrocrete like wet clay, ripping tanks apart with his fists, hurling their carcasses into the air. His roar cracked windows for miles. And when he bellowed, the WAAAGH grew louder than the city itself, shaking towers until they toppled. The hives burned. Millions died screaming, their voices drowned by the thunder of orcs chanting their warlord's name. Yet even in death, the swamp seemed to spread, filth flooding the streets, roots splitting through ferrocrete, waters rising from the ground as if the land itself bent to him. The march became legend. Deserters who escaped whispered of a tide of teeth, a green sea that devoured everything. They spoke of the Ogrins who marched with him, tearing open gates with their bare hands. They spoke of the Gretchen prophet, carried on a throne of scrap, shrieking prayers to Ashoka until his voice bled. They spoke of a silence at the center of it all, a warlord who said little but whose presence drowned the galaxy in terror. Inquisitor Thalisa, broken but alive aboard her ship, heard the reports with bitterness in her lungs. Her ribs ached with every breath, yet her hatred burned hotter than ever. "This cannot be allowed to spread," she spat, her voice harsh. "If other WAAAGHs hear his name, if other orcs believe." She did not finish. She did not need to. The galaxy was already trembling. From orbit, the sight was unmistakable. The surface of the planet seemed to writhe with motion, the green tide stretching outward in waves. Entire sectors glowed with fires, hive cities burning like torches in the dark. The storm of psychic energy surrounding the war rose higher than the clouds, bleeding into the void as a beacon of madness. The march was not of flesh alone. It was of spirit, of belief. The WAAAGH! Energy carried through the stars, whispering into the dreams of orcs light years away. Mobs stirred on distant worlds, raising their heads as if hearing a call. Some claimed to see visions of a swamp, endless and all-consuming, and a figure who ruled it. The orcs named it destiny. The Imperium named it heresy. And the warp laughed, for it knew the truth. Belief made reality. The March of a Million Teeth was not merely battle. It was Genesis. On the ruins of Karthus Prime, Shrek stood amidst fire and smoke. His eyes glowed faint in the haze. Around him, orcs feasted, fought, and howled. The Gretchen prophet scuttled to his feet, bowing low, his thin voice shrieking for silence. "A da swamp spreads. Da swamp eats all. Da swamp God rules da stars." The orcs howled their answer, their WAAAGH cry so loud the ground itself cracked. Shrek did not move. He stared into the flames, his jaw tight, his silence heavy. He muttered only once, too quiet for all but the closest to hear. "This is my swamp." And the world shook with the belief of millions as if to prove him right. If a single world could not contain the swamp, how long before the galaxy itself was drowned? The fires of Karthus Prime still burned, casting their smoke into the heavens, when the whispers began. Among the survivors of the massacre, those few guardsmen who had crawled from the wreckage, those pilgrims who had hidden in cellars, those priests whose sermons had been cut short by the axe, there was no triumph, no solace. There was only silence. Not the silence of victory, nor the silence of death, but a silence heavier than prayer. They had called upon the Emperor. They had begged his light to blaze through the mire. They had lifted relics high, smeared themselves in oils, and sung litanies until their voices cracked. And yet when the green tide came, when the swamp swallowed their cities and the colossus broke their armies, no miracle had answered. The Emperor had been silent. Priests trembled as they tried to explain it. Some declared it a test of faith, a crucible through which only the strongest belief would survive. Others whispered darker things, words that risked the Commissar's bolt pistol, that perhaps the Emperor had turned his face away, unwilling to look upon such blasphemy. Pilgrims wept, clutching their rosaries, their eyes fixed on the burning horizon where the swamp now spread. The ecclesiarchy convened in the void, aboard the grand cathedralship Piety's Dawn. Bishops in golden robes gathered beneath icons of saints, their voices rising in panic. "This swamp warlord is no orc," one cried. "He is a new god clawing at our faith." Another bellowed, "We must call a crusade. We must burn the stars until his name is ash." Yet beneath their shouting, unease festered. For all their fury, they could not deny the truth. The Emperor had not spoken. Inquisitor Thalissa knew it too. She stood alone in her sanctum, her wounds half healed, her augmetic eyes locked upon reports streaming in from across the sector. Entire regiments had broken not from slaughter, but from despair. Men executed for heresy had died with the name Shork on their lips, and the warp whispered louder than ever. She whispered a prayer, her lips cracked and dry. "Oh, why are you silent, Lord? Why do you let this parody mock your throne?" The prayer echoed back to her as nothing. Her teeth clenched. She smashed her fist against the steel altar, its candles toppling. "Answer me," she roared. But no warmth filled her chest, no voice stirred in her mind, only silence. Meanwhile, in Meyerhold, silence was power. Meanwhile, in Meyerhold, the orcs did not question their warlord's lack of words. His muttered phrase, "This is my swamp," was enough. To them, his silence was majesty. They filled it with their own cries, their own chants, their own belief. The Gretchen prophet screeched himself hoarse, declaring Shork the third god, greater than Gork and Mork combined. Orcs painted the name on their armor, carved it into the hides of squigs, burned it into the walls of their fortress. Silence did not weaken him. Silence amplified him. But for humanity, silence was terror. In the underhives of other worlds, cults began to form. They whispered of a green figure who defied the Imperium's armies, who ruled swamp and storm alike. Some painted their walls with crude glyphs of tusked faces, others sang hymns twisted from imperial liturgies, not emperor, not orc, but lord of the mire. The Arbites purged them where they could, yet for every cult broken another rose. Astropaths carried visions of silence across the stars. They dreamt of the golden throne, its light dimming, its occupant unmoving. They dreamt of the astronomican flickering, drowned in swamp mist. Some gouged out their eyes rather than dream again. Others went mad, muttering endlessly of teeth, mud, and silence. The orcs, of course, knew nothing of the Emperor's quiet. They cared nothing for the prayers of men. All they knew was that their warlord grew stronger with every victory, and the silence of their enemies only proved what they already believed, that he was unstoppable. On Terra itself, in the shadow of the throne, whispers reached the High Lords. They debated furiously in sealed chambers, their words laced with dread. If the Emperor is silent in the face of this, what does it mean? One asked. Another hissed, it means nothing. Faith is tested, faith endures. Yet none could silence the fear coiling in their hearts, for the Astronomicon flickered ever so faintly, as if even its eternal flame wavered. Back in the swamp, Shrek sat upon his throne, his yellow eyes heavy with thought. He did not speak, he did not need to. He did not need to. The silence around him was thunder enough. The Gretchen prophet danced in the mud, shrieking prophecy. Ida Emperor's gone quiet. The stars gone quiet. That's 'cause Shork talks now. This is the swamp's galaxy. The orcs howled their agreement. Shrek muttered again, so soft it was almost lost beneath their frenzy. This is my swamp. And the galaxy trembled, not because of his words, but because of the silence that followed them. If the Emperor himself gave no answer, who in the galaxy could stand against the warlord of mud and iron? From Mirhold's broken towers to the burning ruins of Karthus Prime, the tide of greenskins spread outward like rot through wood. They marched in their millions, each mob driven by hunger, madness, and belief. They carved glyphs of teeth and muck into the land itself, gouging their creed into stone walls, hive spires, and the armor of fallen tanks. They did not fight for plunder or survival. They fought for their god, the one they now called Shork, and at their head strode Shrek, the swamp warlord. He was more than orc, more than beast, more than nightmare. He was myth made flesh, and with each step he took, reality bent to his presence. The swamp spread with him. Roads that had stood dry for centuries turned to bog under his tread. Buildings cracked as vines sprouted through their walls. The air grew heavy, damp, filled with the stench of rot and the drone of unseen insects. Whole worlds began to fear that if he left this planet, every star he touched would drown in mire. The Imperium rallied. From orbit descended the angels of death. Drop pods screamed through the skies, their ceramite shells burning as they fell. With thunderclap impacts, they split open, and space marines emerged, giants in armor, their bolters thundering hymns of vengeance. Chapters from distant crusades had been recalled to face this threat. Crimson-armored warriors of the Blood Angels, iron-clad veterans of the Imperial Fists, and others whose names had been sworn to silence for this war. They descended like gods of war, their voices carried through Vox. By the Emperor's light the Xenos will burn. The orcs howled in delight. The swamp boiled with battle. Bolter fire tore through mobs, shells ripping greenskins apart in sprays of gore. Chainswords revved, teeth grinding through muscle and bone. The Marines fought with fury unmatched, each one the strength of 100 guardsmen. They carved a path through the bog, their purity seals snapping in the wind, their prayers echoing louder than the thunder. But the WAAAGH answered. For every orc slain, 10 more surged forward. For every Marine's victory, another mob rose from the mire, their faith unbroken. Stompers belched fire into the heavens, their crude guns hammering even Astartes into the mud. Squigs larger than tanks hurled themselves into battle, tearing power-armored warriors limb from limb before exploding in showers of teeth and bile. The swamp rejoiced, and then Shrek entered the fray. He waded through the blood and muck like a titan, his fists smashing Marines into pulp, his roar louder than bolter fire. A Blood Angel charged him, power sword glowing, his jump pack screaming fire. Shrek caught him mid-flight, crushed him in his grip, and hurled the broken armor into a squad beyond. A storm of bolter fire struck his chest, sparks flying, but he only grew angrier. The Marines called to their chaplain, who raised his Crozius and bellowed litanies. For a moment the Astarte held firm, their courage unwavering. They charged the giant together, blades flashing, guns roaring. Shrek fought them as if swatting insects, yet still they pressed him. For every Marine that fell, another hurled himself at the beast, refusing to let silence be their emperor's only answer. The swamp quaked. Green lightning split the skies, striking towers and igniting the battlefield. The WAAAGH. Energy surged so violently that even Marines faltered, their armor sparking, their minds assaulted by waves of psychic madness. The orcs howled with such frenzy that even the angels of death were drowned in the sound. Above, the Imperial Navy entered the war. Ships in orbit unleashed fire upon the world, their lances burning hive ruins, their bombardments hammering the swamp. Whole swaths of jungle ignited, flames racing across the mire. Orcs burned screaming, yet they laughed even as they died, their belief undimmed. For in their eyes the flames only proved the scale of their god. If the galaxy itself must burn to stop him, surely that was victory. Shrek looked up. His eyes glowed with firelight, reflecting the storms of orbital bombardment. He did not cower, he did not run, he did not run. He raised both fists and roared into the heavens, a sound so immense it cracked the clouds themselves. The WAAAGH cry surged upward, meeting the bombardment like a wall. Vox networks collapsed, navigators screamed in blindness, and the Astronomicon itself flickered. The Inquisition demanded exterminatus. From the bridge of her vessel, Inquisitor Thalissa pressed her hand to the rune. Her voice was ragged, her body broken, but her will was steel. "Purge this world," she ordered. "Let no trace remain. If the swamp spreads, the Imperium will fall." But even as she gave the command, doubt twisted her heart. Could fire truly kill this being? Could a world's death silence belief that had already bled into the warp? On the planet's surface, the Marines withdrew, their dead carried by thunderhawks. Guardsmen scattered, commissars executed deserters, and priests screamed for faith. Yet through it all the orcs remained. Meyerhold burned, but its walls stood. The swamp shrank beneath bombardment, but it lived. And Shrek, the warlord they named Shork, still stood amidst fire and blood. He slumped upon the ruins of his throne, half shattered by artillery, and whispered again, "This is my swamp." The orcs bellowed his name. The prophet shrieked, the swamp echoed, and the galaxy trembled at the truth. If the Imperium must burn worlds to halt him, how many will be sacrificed before the green apocalypse consumes them all? The sky burned. Imperial bombardments rained down ceaselessly, their lances tearing gouges in the earth, their torpedoes shattering cities into oceans of fire. From orbit, the world looked like a dying ember, choked in smoke, wrapped in storms of ash. Vox signals shrieked with desperate orders and dying prayers, but few remained to hear them. For on the surface, the swamp still lived. Meyerhold, though broken, did not fall. Its towers of rust and bone, half shattered by artillery, still loomed above the mire. Its gates, cracked and bent, still barred Imperial tanks, and its heart, its throne of iron and corpses, still bore the weight of the swamp warlord. Shrek sat slouched upon that throne, blood and mud dripping from his frame. His tusks were cracked, his hide torn, his fists slick with gore. Yet his eyes burned with weary defiance, smouldering like dying coals that refused to dim. Around him, orcs feasted and roared, their laughter deafening even amidst bombardment. For to them, defeat was impossible. Their god still sat upon his seat. Their swamp still breathed. The Gretchen prophet, bloodied but alive, danced in the mud at his feet. His shrill voice carried over the din. "A Shork don't fall. Shork don't break. Dis is dear swamp eternal," and the mobs howled it back. At a swamp eternal, their chant shook the mire, feeding the storm of WAAAGH, energy that no bombardment could quench. The air vibrated with belief, heavy as chains, intoxicating as fire. The orcs grew wilder, their eyes burning with green light, their laughter turning into shrieks of ecstasy. For them, every shell, every lance, every strike upon their world was proof that the galaxy itself feared their god. Above aboard her vessel, Inquisitor Thalissa watched with cold fury. Reports streamed in, entire regiments annihilated, cities drowned in swamp, even space marines forced to withdraw. Her rosette gleamed under the light of failing hololiths, but its power felt hollow. Hollow. Her lips cracked as she whispered the words no Inquisitor should ever speak. He cannot be stopped. Her hand hovered over the final command rune, Exterminatus, the burning of the world in holy fire, a last resort, a certainty of death. Yet as she stared down at the storm below, she knew that fire would not erase belief. Already, cults whispered his name on distant worlds. Already the warp carried his echo. To destroy this planet would be to martyr him, to prove to orcs and men alike that the Imperium had feared. And the Emperor was silent still. On the surface, the swamp spread through the fire. The bombardment scarred it, burned it, buried it under rubble. Yet it always returned. Ash turned to muck, wreckage sank into mire, and from each crater bubbled new waters, green and foul, alive with squigs and insects. The swamp did not retreat. It adapted. It endured. Shrek rose. The battlefield stilled as the giant stood, his silhouette towering over ruin and flame. He stepped down from the throne, each stride echoing like thunder. Mud clung to his frame, dripping in heavy sheets. His breath rolled out in steaming clouds, stinking of rot and blood. He raised his head toward the heavens, where imperial fire streaked across the clouds, and he roared. The sound shook the planet. The orcs bellowed in answer, their WAAAGH cry rising so high it became a wall of sound, drowning out artillery, drowning out bombardments, drowning out reason itself. The psychic storm flared into an inferno, the sky splitting with green lightning that lashed at imperial ships in orbit. Entire Vox networks burned out. Astropaths fell into seizures. Navigators clawed their own faces, blinded by visions of swamps drowning stars. In that moment, the swamp was eternal. The Imperium could burn the planet to ash, but the idea had already escaped. Across the galaxy, orcs stirred, raising their heads to visions of a third god. They shouted his name, twisted though it was, Shrek. On desert worlds, mobs painted his tusked face into the sand. On jungle planets, tribes carved his words into tree trunks. On distant battlefields, orcs laughed in the face of bolter fire, screaming, "This is our swamp." Belief had made him real. Belief would keep him real. Even chaos watched. Demons whispered of him in the warp, their laughter carrying through eternity. Some called him a parody of gods. Others called him a herald of something new. But all agreed on one thing: his echo could not be silenced. He was not worshipped by design, nor by bargain, nor by pact. He was worshipped because he simply was, and that made him dangerous beyond measure. The orcs surged outward, their march unending. They spread through the ruins, across the bogs, into the burning cities, a tide of green that no wall could hold. But their teeth gleamed in the firelight, their choppers dripped with blood, their banners flapped in the smoke. The galaxy had seen many WAAAGHs, but never one like this. This was not only an army. This was faith incarnate. Shrek stood amidst it all, his roar fading into silence. He looked down upon the swamp, upon the blood, upon the fire. His tusked mouth tightened. His voice, deep as thunder yet weary as stone, rumbled one last time. "This is my swamp." The orc screamed it back louder than any prayer. The world burned. The swamp spread. The warp laughed. And somewhere, in the stillness of the golden throne, the Emperor gave no answer. The silence was eternal. The swamp was eternal. The war was eternal. And so the galaxy asked the question it feared most. Was the swamp warlord truly just an orc made god? Or something far older, summoned by the madness of reality itself to mock every throne, every creed, every light that dared oppose him?